The Voldorian Empire had ruled the stars for 12,000 years, and no one alive could remember a time before their iron grip held the galaxy in chains. Their warships numbered in the millions, and their conquered worlds stretched across 100,000 star systems where dozens of species lived and died at their command. Admiral Cathrell stood on the bridge of the Imperial flagship Ascendant throne and watched the holographic displays flicker with eras he had never seen in his 3 centuries of service. Communication nodes across 17 sectors had gone dark at the exact same moment, and this was not a malfunction or an attack, but something far stranger. Report, he demanded with a voice that had commanded fleets and broken rebellions. His communications officer was a young Voldorian with pale blue scales that had turned nearly white with fear. Admiral, we cannot reach the Imperial core. The High Council does not respond. The Emperor's palace has gone silent. Every relay station between here and the homeworld has simply stopped transmitting. Cathrall felt something cold settle in his chest. In 12,000 years, the Voldorian communication network had never failed. It was the backbone of their empire, and the tool that let them crush any hint of rebellion before it could spread. Send scout ships, he ordered. I want eyes on every major installation within 10 light years. The scouts launched within the hour, but Cathrall already knew something terrible had happened. He could feel it in his bones the way a sailor feels a storm before the clouds appear on the frontier world of Nexus 7. Far from the centers of Voldorian power, a human archaeologist named Samuel Grant was having the strangest day of his life. He had spent 15 years digging through alien ruins on a dozen different worlds, and he had never found anything like this. The chamber was 3 miles beneath the planet's surface at the end of a tunnel that should not have existed. The walls were made of a material that looked like stone, but felt warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with a faint inner light. Beth, he called to his assistant who was cataloging artifacts near the entrance. You need to come see this right now. Dr. Beth Morgan made her way carefully across the uneven floor, and her headlamp cast dancing shadows on the ancient walls. She was 32 years old with short brown hair and the kind of practical attitude that made her invaluable on field expeditions. What did you find? She asked. Samuel pointed to a tablet embedded in the far wall. It was covered in symbols that glowed with soft golden light, and the glow had started the moment his fingers touched the surface. I have studied every known alien language in the database, he said quietly. This is not Voldorian. This is not from any of the subject species. This predates everything we know by at least 50,000 years. Beth leaned closer, and her breath caught in her throat. Those symbols at the bottom, Samuel, I can read them. What do you mean you can read them? I mean, I understand what they say. It is like I have always known this language, but I forgot it until right now. She traced the glowing characters with trembling fingers. It says, Children of Earth. It says when the chains grow too heavy, we will answer. The tablet pulsed brighter, and somewhere, deep beneath their feet, something massive began to hum with power. 300 light years away, Commander Lisa Page stood on the bridge of the human patrol vessel, steadfast, and tried to make sense of what her sensors were telling her. The Voldorian outpost on the moon below had sent an automated distress signal 2 hours ago, but now there was nothing. No life signs and no communications and no movement of any kind. Take us in closer. She ordered Lieutenant Kevin Scott worked the navigation controls and brought them into orbit. He was a young man with red hair and freckles who had grown up on a mining colony where humans worked 18-hour shifts to meet Voldorian tribute demands. Commander, I am reading the station is fully powered, all systems operational, but 0 life forms. Lisa felt a chill run down her spine. Prepare a boarding party. I want to know what happened down there. They found the station exactly as the sensors had described. The lights were on and the air was fresh, and everything was in perfect working order. But the Valdorians who had crewed the facility were simply gone in. The mess hall they found meals sitting on tables with steam still rising from the food. In the command center, they found duty logs that ended mid-sentence. In the docking bay, they found every ship still locked in its berth, with no sign that anyone had tried to escape. "This is impossible," Kevin said as they walked through empty corridors that should have held hundreds of Valdorian soldiers. "Where did they go?" Lisa picked up a datapad that someone had dropped on the floor. The screen showed a half-written message to a family back on the Valdorian homeworld, and the writer had stopped in the middle of a word. "I do not think they went anywhere," she said slowly. "I think something came and took them." Back on Nexus 7, the humming had grown louder, and Samuel and Beth had retreated to the surface, where they found the entire planet in chaos. Ancient structures that scholars had dismissed, as natural rock formations were rising from the ground and unfolding. Like flowers made of metal and crystal, Governor Patricia Lane had called an emergency meeting, and her office was filled with frightened officials who had no idea what was happening. She was a tall woman in her 50s with gray hair and the steady calm that came from 20 years of managing a frontier colony. "Dr. Grant," she said when Samuel and Beth arrived, "please tell me you have some explanation for what is happening to my planet." Samuel took a deep breath and tried to organize thoughts that still did not quite make sense. "Governor, we found something underground. A message left by a species that existed long before the Valdorians or anyone else we know about. They called themselves the Shepherds, and they claimed to have created humanity millions of years ago." The room went silent. "They seeded us across the galaxy," Samuel continued. "They watched over us as we grew. And they left something behind, a failsafe. A weapon that would activate if their children ever needed help." "Help against what?" Patricia asked. "Against anyone who tried to enslave us." Outside the window, the ancient structures had finished unfolding, and they were transmitting something into the sky. A signal that traveled faster than light and reached into places that existed between dimensions, where a fleet had waited patiently for this moment for longer than human civilization had existed. Children of Earth had called for help, and something was finally answering. The signal from Nexus 7 traveled through dimensions that human science had never imagined, and it reached a place that existed outside of normal space, where time moved differently and ancient things slumbered in the dark. The shipyard had been built before the Valdorians crawled from their homeworlds, oceans, and it held a fleet that could reshape the galaxy on Earth. Admiral Marcus Cole stood in a war room deep beneath the Pentagon and watched reports flood in from every human settlement in known space. He was 63 years old with silver hair and scars on his hands from the rebellion he had led 30 years ago, when humans on a dozen worlds had tried and failed to throw off Valdorian rule. Every Valdorian installation within 50 light years has gone silent, reported General Diana Webb as she updated the holographic display. Their patrol fleets have vanished. Their tribute collectors never arrived at any of their scheduled stops. "It could be a trap," Marcus said carefully. "The Valdorians have ruled humanity for 300 years. They do not simply disappear." Diana shook her head and pulled up another display. "Sir, our deep space sensors detected something else. Massive energy signatures emerging from what looks like tears in space itself. The readings are off every scale we have." "Where are they heading?" "Here, Admiral. They are heading directly toward Earth." The first ships emerged from dimensional rifts above Earth's moon, and they were so large that human observers thought they were seeing new celestial bodies appear in the sky. Each dreadnought was over 50 miles long, and their hulls were covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change when you looked at them directly. Marcus ordered every human ship in the solar system to fall back to a defensive position, but he knew in his heart that if these vessels wanted to destroy humanity, there was nothing anyone could do to stop them. The human fleet was made up of salvaged Valdorian cast-offs and aging transports that had been converted for war. These new arrivals were something else entirely. "We are receiving a transmission," Diana reported with a voice that trembled slightly. "It is using human communication protocols. Standard English. Put it through." A voice filled the war room, and it was synthetic, but somehow warm and gentle, like a parent speaking to a child they had not seen in a very long time. "Children of Earth, we have heard your call. The Shepherd fleet has awakened. We are here to serve." Commander Lisa Page received new orders 3 hours later, and she took the Steadfast to rendezvous with one of the smaller vessels in the awakened fleet. Even the smallest ship was 10 times larger than anything humans had ever built, and its hull seemed to glow with an inner light. "We are being invited to dock," Kevin reported from his station. "The ship says it wants to meet us." Lisa had never been more afraid in her life, but she was also curious in a way she could not explain. She ordered the Steadfast into the docking bay and led a small team through the airlock into the ancient vessel. The interior was nothing like she expected. The corridors were dark when they entered, but lights began to appear as they walked forward, and the walls seemed to shift and reshape themselves to accommodate human proportions. Handrails appeared at the right height, and doors widened to let them pass. "Welcome, daughter of Earth," the same warm voice said from speakers that had not existed a moment before. "This vessel has waited many ages for you. Please, come to the command center. There is much to discuss." The command center was a vast circular room with a single chair at its heart, and displays that showed the surrounding space in perfect detail. Lisa approached the chair slowly, and when she sat down, the entire room came alive with light and information. "This ship is called the Shepherd's Grace in your language," the voice explained. "It was built to serve humanity, and it will respond to your commands. All ships of the Shepherd fleet are the same. They are your inheritance." "Our inheritance from whom?" Lisa asked. "From those who created you. The beings you will call the Precursors walked the stars when this galaxy was young. They seeded life on countless worlds and watched their children grow. Humanity was their last creation and their greatest hope on Earth." Admiral Marcus Cole had boarded the flagship of the Shepherd fleet and found himself standing in a room that defied description. The walls showed images from human history stretching back millions of years, and he saw things that no human had ever known. Ancient cities on Earth that had risen and fallen before. Recorded history and ships that had carried human colonists to distant worlds in ages long. Forgotten, the Precursors knew they could not protect you forever, the ship's voice told him. They saw what the Valdorians would become, and they left us here to wait. When your enemy touched you, we began to wake. When they made you slaves, we started to prepare. When you called out in your desperation, we answered. What happened to the Valdorians? Marcus asked. They have been returned to their homeworld. Every Valdorian in the galaxy was taken in a single moment and placed in a state that your language calls temporal stasis. They are frozen in time, aware but unable to move or speak. They will remain that way until we decide they have learned their lesson. Marcus felt his knees go weak. An entire species spanning thousands of worlds had been swept away in an instant and imprisoned on their homeworld like children sent to their rooms. The power required to do that was beyond anything he could imagine. Why give this power to us? He asked. Why not just rule the galaxy yourselves? Because that is not our purpose. The voice replied, we were built to protect and to serve. The Precursors wanted their children to inherit the stars, but they wanted you to earn that inheritance through your choices. The Shepherd fleet will follow human commands. What you do with this power is up to you. Back on the Shepherd's Grace, Lisa Page was learning to interface with the ship and discovering that it was easier than she ever could have imagined. The vessel responded to her thoughts and her intentions, and it showed her things that made her weep with wonder. Star maps that revealed the true scope of the precursor civilization and records of their final days when they had chosen to leave the galaxy rather than risk becoming tyrants over their own children. They were afraid of themselves, she realized. Aloud, yes, the ship confirmed. They grew too powerful. They could have ruled forever, but they knew that power corrupts even the wisest beings. So they built us and left us as guardians and departed for somewhere else. We do not know where they went. We only know they loved you enough to give you this chance. Lieutenant Kevin Scott found Lisa still sitting in the command chair hours later with tears drying on her cheeks. Commander, Admiral Cole is calling a meeting of all human fleet commanders. He wants to discuss what we do next. Lisa nodded slowly and stood up from the chair that had shown her the truth about humanity's place in the universe. The Voldorian Empire had crumbled without a trace, and human warfleets had materialized to fill the void. Now, the real question remained, what would humanity do with this incredible gift? 3 weeks had passed since the Shepherd fleet awakened, and the galaxy had not stopped trembling. The Voldorian Empire that had seemed eternal and unbreakable had vanished overnight, and in its place humanity now commanded over 4,000 warships of unimaginable power. Admiral Marcus Cole had established his headquarters aboard the fleet's flagship, which the crew had named Humanity's Dawn after a vote that included every human who had come aboard. The ship's original designation was a string of sounds that no human throat could produce, so a new name seemed appropriate for this new beginning. We have finished analyzing the historical archives, Dr. Beth Morgan reported as she entered the Admiral's ready room. She had been reassigned from Nexus 7 to serve as the fleet's chief archaeologist, and the work had consumed her completely for the past weeks. The information is extraordinary, but also troubling. Marcus set down the coffee cup he had been holding and gave her his full attention. Tell me what you found. Beth activated a holographic display, and images began to flow through the air between them. The precursors did not just create humanity. They seeded dozens of species across the galaxy over a period of about 50 million years. Each species was designed with specific traits and given specific gifts. Were the Voldorians one of their creations? No. The Voldorians evolved naturally, like most spacefaring races. But the precursors watched them rise, and they watched them begin to conquer. The archives contain detailed observations of Voldorian expansion, going back 8,000 years before they ever reached Earth. Marcus leaned forward with growing unease. They knew what the Voldorians would become, and they did nothing to stop them. They believed in allowing younger races to make their own choices, Beth explained. But they also established certain boundaries. The Shepherd fleets were programmed to activate if any of the precursors' children were truly threatened. When the Voldorians began taking human slaves, the countdown began. How long was the countdown? 300 years. The exact duration of Voldorian rule over humanity. The Admiral stood and walked to the window that showed the stars beyond. 300 years of suffering and death and forced labor. 300 years while ancient ships waited in the dark for the right moment. He wondered if the precursors had truly understood what their patience would cost. Samuel Grant had been brought aboard Humanity's Dawn to help interpret the precursor archives, and he spent most of his days in the vast library chamber where holographic records stretched back to the dawn of the galaxy. He was there when Admiral Cole and Beth Morgan came to find him with urgent questions. Dr. Grant, Marcus said, we need to know what happened to the Voldorians. The ships tell us they were placed in temporal stasis, but we need to understand exactly what that means. Samuel called up a display that showed the Voldorian homeworld, wrapped in a shimmering energy field. The precursors developed this technology millions of years ago as a way to preserve endangered ecosystems. Time inside the field moves so slowly that 1 billion years would pass like a single heartbeat. The Valdorians are aware of their situation, but they cannot move or speak or do anything except think. For how long? Beth asked quietly. The archives are not clear on that point. The stasis field will remain active until the Shepherd fleet decides the Valdorians have genuinely changed. But how that decision gets made is beyond my understanding. Commander Lisa Page had taken the Shepherd's Grace on a mission to the former Valdorian homeworld to see the situation firsthand. Kevin Scott stood beside her on the observation deck as they approached the imprisoned planet, and neither of them had words for what they were. Seeing the energy field was beautiful in a terrible way. It sparkled with colors that had no names in human language, and it covered the entire world like a soap bubble made of starlight. Through the field, they could see the outlines of cities and spaceports frozen in the moment of their imprisonment. The ship says there are approximately 80 billion Valdorians on that planet, Kevin reported. Every single member of their species from across the entire galaxy was returned here in the same instant. They were not harmed. They were just collected and preserved. Lisa thought about the labor camps, where she had grown up, and the tribute ships that had taken everything her colony produced. She thought about her parents, who had died from exhaustion before she was old enough to remember their faces. She thought about all the billions of humans who had suffered under Valdorian rule. Is this justice? She asked herself aloud. I do not know, Kevin admitted. But it is not cruelty either. They are not being tortured. They are just being forced to stop. For how long, though? Forever. The Shepherd's Grace provided an answer through the speakers around them. The stasis will end when the Valdorians have truly understood the wrong they committed. When their hearts have changed and they are ready to live alongside other species as equals. This may take centuries or millennia. The decision is not yours to make. Lisa found that answer troubling in ways she could not fully explain. The Valdorians had been monsters who deserved punishment, but she was not comfortable with the idea of eternal imprisonment. Even for monsters, news of the Valdorian fate spread rapidly through the galaxy, and the reaction among the former subject species was complicated. Many celebrated the fall of their oppressors and danced in the streets of worlds that had known nothing but fear for generations. Others looked at humanity with new terror in their eyes. The Kathmari Collective sent an ambassador to meet with Admiral Cole, and the being that arrived was unlike anything humans had encountered before. Ambassador Vethel was tall and thin with iridescent wings that folded against her back and compound eyes that seemed to see everything at once. Admiral Cole, she said as she entered the meeting chamber. The Kathmari have spent 2,000 years serving the Valdorians. We mined their ore and built their ships and died in their wars. Now we learn that you command weapons that can imprison an entire species with a thought. We did not choose this power, Marcus replied carefully. It was given to us. That is precisely what concerns us, Bethel said. The Valdorians did not choose their power either. They simply discovered they were stronger than their neighbors, and they decided that strength gave them the right to rule. How do we know humanity will be any different? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Marcus realized that this was the moment that would define humanity's place in the galaxy. The Shepherd fleet had given them incredible power, but power without wisdom was just another form of tyranny. I cannot give you guarantees, he said finally. I can only tell you what we intend to do. We are calling a gathering of all spacefaring species to discuss the future. Every voice will be heard. Every concern will be addressed. And humanity will not make any major decisions about the galaxy's future without consulting the other species who share it with us. Vethel studied him with those strange compound eyes for a long moment. Words are easy, Admiral. We will be watching to see if your actions match your promises. She turned and left the chamber, and Marcus sat alone with the weight of a galaxy pressing down on his shoulders. The Voldorians had ruled through fear and force, and humanity now had the power to do the same. The choice of what kind of species they would become had never been more important. The Great Gathering took place on Nexus 7, where the beacon had first awakened, and representatives from over 200 species came to witness the birth of something new. The ancient structures that had risen from the ground now served as meeting halls, and their crystalline walls amplified every voice so that all could hear Admiral Marcus Cole open the assembly with a speech that was broadcast to every inhabited world in the known galaxy. "We stand at a crossroads," he said. "The old order has fallen, and we must decide together what will take its place. Humanity has been given great power, but we refuse to wield it alone. The stars belong to all of us." Not everyone agreed with this approach. Senator Victor Mills had traveled from Earth to argue for a different path, and he demanded to be heard before the assembly. He was a large man with a booming voice and a face hardened by years of fighting against Veldorian occupation. 300 years, he said as he took the speaking platform. For 300 years humanity suffered under the Voldorian boot. We lost billions of our people to their labor camps. We watched our children starve so the Valdorian nobles could feast. Now we have the power to ensure that never happens again, and some want us to give that power away. A murmur ran through the assembled delegates, and Marcus could see fear flickering in many alien eyes. This was exactly what they had worried about. Victor continued with growing passion. "I am not saying we should become conquerors. I'm saying we should be protectors. The Shepherd fleet should remain under human command because it was given to humans. We can use it to maintain peace and prevent any species from dominating the others." Ambassador Catherine Ellis rose to respond, and she was a small woman with gray hair and a gentle voice that somehow carried more weight than Victor's shouting. "And who decides what peace looks like, Senator? Who determines which species has grown too powerful? If humanity alone controls the fleet, then humanity alone makes those judgments. That is not protection. That is ruled by another name. You would have us surrender the only advantage we have ever had," Victor shot back. "You would leave humanity defenseless. I would have us build something that does not require any species to be defenseless," Catherine replied. The Valdorians ruled through fear because they believed strength was the only thing that mattered. "If we follow that same path, we will become what we hated." The debate continued for hours, and Marcus listened to every argument with growing concern. Both sides had valid points, and he could see how easily humanity could slip into tyranny while convincing themselves they were being righteous. It was Ambassador Vethal who finally broke through the deadlock. She rose on wings that shimmered in the light of the ancient hall, and her voice was calm but carried clearly to every corner. "I wish to share something with this assembly," she said. "The Cathmari have a saying that has guided our people for 10,000 years. Power held alone becomes poison. Power shared becomes strength. The Valdorians never understood this wisdom, and they fell. Will humanity learn from their mistake?" Governor Patricia Lane stood to respond, and her voice was steady despite the weight of the moment. "Ambassador, what would you suggest?" "A true coalition," Bethel said. "Not an empire with a different name, not a protectorate where one species guards the others like a shepherd guards sheep, but a partnership where every member has equal voice and equal responsibility. The Shepherd fleet should serve the coalition as a whole, not any single species. That the ships only respond to human commands," someone called out from the assembly. "How can other species share control of something they cannot operate?" Dr. Beth Morgan stepped forward to address this concern, and Samuel Grant joined her at the platform. "We have been studying the precursor archives extensively," Beth explained. "The ships respond to human biology because they were designed that way. But they can also accept commands from any being that a human captain designates as authorized. The limitation is not absolute." Samuel added his own insight. The precursors did not intend for humanity to rule alone. The archives show that they seeded many species with the potential to interface with their technology. It was always meant to be shared. The ships were just keyed to us first because we needed them most urgently. This revelation changed the tone of the debate, and Marcus felt hope stirring in his chest for the first time since the discussion began. Perhaps there was a path forward that did not require humanity to choose between weakness and tyranny. The final vote took 3 days as each delegation consulted with their homeworlds and considered the implications of every choice. In the end, the proposal that won approval was more radical than anyone had expected the Galactic Coalition would be, governed by a council where every member species had equal representation regardless of size or power. The Shepherd fleet would serve as a peacekeeping force answerable to this council, and human captains would share command authority with officers from other species. Humanity would hold no special position beyond their biological connection to the ship's senator. Victor Mills cast his vote against the proposal and stormed out of the assembly hall with fury written on his face. He would spend years afterward arguing that humanity had given away its birthright, but he would never gain enough support to change the decision. Commander Lisa Page voted in favor and felt tears streaming down her face as the final count was announced. Kevin Scott put a hand on her shoulder, and they stood together watching history unfold. Is this what they wanted? Kevin asked quietly. The precursors. Did they hope we would make this choice? I think so, Lisa replied. They gave us power, but they also gave us the wisdom to know that power alone is not enough. They trusted us to figure out the rest. On the observation deck of humanity's dawn, Admiral Marcus Cole stood with General Diana Webb and watched the delegations departing for their homeworlds. Each ship carried the seeds of a new civilization and the hope that this time things would be different. Do you think it will work? Diana asked. I do not know, Marcus admitted. The Valdorians ruled for 12,000 years because they never questioned their right to dominate. We have chosen a harder path. We have chosen to share power with species we barely know and trust that cooperation is stronger than control. That sounds terrifying. It is. Marcus agreed. But I think that is the point. The precursors could have built ships that would obey any command without question. Instead, they built ships that respond to intention and character. They wanted us to become worthy of the power before we could truly wield it. Diana considered this for a moment and then nodded slowly. Then I suppose we had better start proving ourselves worthy. The Coalition's first official act was to send relief missions to worlds still suffering from Valdorian exploitation, and human ships flew alongside Kethmari vessels and a dozen other species. The galaxy watched this cooperation unfold, and slowly the fear began to fade. Something new was being born in the spaces between stars, and it was built on trust instead of terror. The precursors had hoped their children would one day reach this moment, and they had not been disappointed. 5 years had passed since the founding of the Galactic Coalition, and the galaxy had transformed beyond recognition. Trade routes that had once carried tribute to Valdorian overlords now carried goods between equal partners and worlds that had known only fear were learning what it meant to be free. Admiral Lisa Page stood on the observation deck of humanity's dawn and watched a convoy of relief ships departing for the outer reaches. She had risen quickly through the ranks during the chaos of the early years, and now she commanded the entire First Shepherd fleet. Kevin Scott served as her second in command, and his captain's insignia gleamed in the soft light. The Tethrani ambassador asked about the Valdorians again, Kevin said, as he joined her at the viewport. She wants to know when we plan to release them from stasis. Lisa sighed and rubbed her temples. This question came up at nearly every council meeting, and she never had a satisfying answer. What did you tell her? The truth. We do not know how to release them, even if we wanted to. The precursor technology responds to something we cannot measure or control. The ships believe the Voldorians have not learned their lesson yet. And how do ships determine when someone has learned a lesson? Kevin shook his head. I asked Humanity's Dawn that same question last week. The answer was something about the collective emotional state of the imprisoned species. Apparently, the stasis field can sense their thoughts in some way. When they truly understand what they did wrong and genuinely want to change the field, will release them automatically. Lisa looked out at the stars and thought about the billions of Voldorians frozen on their homeworld. They had committed terrible crimes against countless species, but she still felt uncomfortable with the idea of punishment that might last forever. It was justice without mercy, and she was not sure that was truly justice at all on Earth. Dr. Samuel Grant had returned to teaching at the university, where he had studied before the awakening. His classroom was filled with students from a dozen different species, and they all wanted to learn about the ancient history that had shaped their present. The precursors understood something that we are only beginning to grasp. He told his class one morning, power and wisdom must grow together or they become destructive. They had the ability to rule the entire galaxy forever, but they chose to leave instead because they feared what they might become. A young Kathmari student raised her wing to ask a question. Professor Grant, do you think the precursors made the right choice? They could have prevented so much suffering if they had stayed. Samuel considered the question carefully before answering. I think they believed that suffering is part of how species learn and grow. If they had protected us from everything, we would never have developed the strength to face challenges on our own. They gave us the tools we needed and trusted us to figure out the rest. Dr. Beth Morgan now served as the Coalition's chief historian, and she traveled constantly between worlds documenting the new civilization, rising from the ashes of the old. Her latest project was a comprehensive record of the transition period, and she interviewed survivors from every species that had lived under Voldorian rule. The stories she collected were heartbreaking and inspiring in equal measure. She heard about families torn apart by tribute demands and reunited after the liberation. She learned about resistance fighters who had given their lives for a freedom they never expected to see. She documented the slow healing of wounds that had festered for centuries. Admiral Marcus Cole had retired from active service after the Coalition's first year, and he spent his time now working with young officers at the newly established Coalition Academy. General Diana Webb had taken his place commanding the combined fleets, and he trusted her completely. Do you ever regret stepping down? Diana asked him during one of her visits to the Academy. Marcus smiled and shook his head. I spent my whole life fighting, first against the Voldorians, and then to build something better. Now it is time for the next generation to carry that burden. My job is to teach them what we learned so they do not have to make the same mistakes. Governor Patricia Lane had been elected as humanity's first representative to the Coalition Council, and she had earned the respect of every species through her fairness and dedication. She worked tirelessly to ensure that the mistakes of the Voldorian era would never be repeated. The Council met once a month in the Great Hall on Nexus 7, and their debates were often fierce, but always respectful. Every voice was heard and every concern was addressed. The process was slower than a dictatorship, but it built trust that no amount of force could create. Senator Victor Mills still argued that humanity had given away too much power, but his following had dwindled over the years as people saw the Coalition working. Even he had to admit that the galaxy was more peaceful and prosperous than it had ever been under Voldorian rule. The beacon on Nexus 7 still pulsed with faint golden light, and scientists from every species came to study its mysteries. They learned that other beacons existed on other worlds, keyed to other species that the precursors had seeded across the cosmos. Someday those beacons might awaken and humanity would meet cousins they had never known. Commander Kevin Scott had been promoted to captain of the Shepherd's Grace, and he took the vessel on exploration missions to the galaxy's edge. He sent back reports of wonders that no one had ever seen and mysteries that might take centuries to solve. Lisa received his latest transmission as she prepared for another council meeting, and she smiled at his enthusiasm. He had found evidence of precursor activity in a region that no ship had ever explored, and he wanted permission to investigate further. Tell him to be careful, she instructed her communications officer. And to keep us informed, the precursors left many gifts, but they also left many dangers. We are still learning how to tell the difference. In the vast spaces between galaxies, something watched humanity's progress with what might have been pride. The precursors had placed their faith in their children and hoped against hope that when the moment came they would choose wisdom over power. They had not been disappointed. The Shepherd fleet continued its patrols, and the coalition continued to grow, and the galaxy continued to heal from wounds that had seemed permanent just a few years before. It was not a perfect civilization because no civilization could be perfect, but it was built on principles that the precursors would have recognized. Trust instead of fear, cooperation instead of domination, hope instead of despair. Samuel Grant stood at his classroom window one evening watching the stars appear in the darkening sky, and Beth Morgan came to stand beside him. They had married 2 years ago in a ceremony attended by friends from a dozen different worlds. Do you think they are still out there? Beth asked. The precursors, do you think they are watching us? I hope so, Samuel replied. I would like them to see what we have become. I would like them to know that their faith in us was justified. The beacon's light pulsed gently in the distance, and somewhere across the galaxy, the Shepherd fleet stood ready to protect and serve. Imperial command had faltered and human Warfleets had materialized, and the empire that had seemed eternal had crumbled without a trace. But from those ashes, something greater had risen. Something that honored the past while building toward a future that the precursors had dreamed of millions of years ago. The children of Earth had come into their inheritance, and they had proven themselves worthy of the stars, and that was only the beginning.